It is my delight to introduce to you my dear friend and colleague, Josh Teplitsky, and we've known each other now for decades. But 5 years ago, exactly 5 years ago in April, Josh and I gathered on Zoom, our first Zoom event after everything shut down, to discuss epidemics in Jewish history. We did so in response to our own experiences, the shutdown, not knowing where this would all go. We discussed material, historical material, and also material and religious responses to past epidemics. During our conversation, Josh quoted one of his sources saying, "This too shall pass." And I expressed exasperation at the idea because it seemed incredulous at that moment, sitting there a month into the shutdown, not knowing where it would end, that this too will pass. But here we are, 5 years later. Indeed, the pandemic has passed, and now we are living in the pandemic's aftermath. And that's what Josh will discuss with us today. So Josh Teplitsky needs no introduction to our community. Again, not just the 5 years ago, our two-part series on Jewish history and the past pandemics, but he's also been part of our webinars events before. He's a nationally and internationally recognized scholar of early modern Jewish history, and is currently the Joseph Meyerhoff Associate Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Pennsylvania. He has published widely, and his book, Prince of the Press: How One Collector Built History's Most Enduring and Remarkable Jewish Library, won the Salo-Baron Prize of the American Academy of Jewish Research for the best first book in Jewish studies, the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award for the Association of Jewish Studies, and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. In 2022, Josh published an edited volume with Sharon Lieberman-Mintz and Warren Klein entitled "Be Fruitful: The Etrog in Jewish Art, Culture, and History," and we hosted a book launch webinar in 2022. He's currently at work on a book provisionally titled, I don't know whether it's still titled like that, but titles change, "Quarantine in the Prague Ghetto: Jews, Christians, and the Plague in Early Modern Europe," which reconstructs a six-month plague epidemic in the city of Prague in the early 18th century. Josh has held prestigious fellowships, including Albert and Rachel Lehman Jr. Research Fellowship at Oxford, the Ed Hadid Fellowship in Israel, Harry Starr Fellowship at Harvard, and before he joined the Penn faculty, he was a fellow at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. He also received grants from the Wellcome Trust, the American Academy for Jewish Research, and there are many, many other examples I could give to show you Professor Josh Teplitsky's international recognition. So Josh, without further ado, the floor or screen is yours.
Now that we have a nice full room, I'll come up.
Okay. So let's switch the, oops, sorry, come on. This is the stupid thing that we have to somehow.
Should be good.
You should be able to.
Right. Thanks, Magda. Hi, everyone. Is it comfortable enough to see me? Can you craning your necks like that? Okay, great. This is such a lovely turnout for a Wednesday afternoon on an unseasonably cold April day. So lovely to have so many people here. And yeah, let's get right into it. Thank you, Magda, for that lovely introduction. Emmanuel, thank you for being a co-host. Siobhan, thank you for all of the work that goes into this, including the beautiful food that's over there. I hope people will feel comfortable also getting up in the middle of my talking to refill your plates. I understand that all the food has to go. So please make sure that that happens over the course of the time here. There's bread that remains, and Passover is coming very soon. So that all has to be consumed before Passover starts. So please do, if you haven't had the chance to get up and eat, please don't feel that it will be rude in any way for you to refill your plates or your cups. I would be delighted for this to take on something of a more informal tone. And we'll see what we can get into. And I do also want to extend my thanks. I got a moment to review some of the beautiful materials out there, and wanted to extend my thanks as well to the people who are behind the gifts that go into making wonderful materials like this available to us to think with today. And I'm even going to try to keep my remarks as short as possible. Well, not that short, but as short as possible, so that we can get out and actually get a glance at the wonderful exhibit as well. It's funny that Magda started by saying that we used to go for these walks, and that I think confidently, or perhaps overconfidently, would talk about how this too shall pass. I'm no longer as optimistic as I once was when we had those chats. Maybe it was even a kind of coping mechanism for myself when I thought about what do I need to know or think or feel in order to survive. And we can talk about what surviving means, but in order to comport myself in a way to survive this moment of crisis. And my goal for today is for us to think about after. And by after, I mean all kinds of different things. We're going to think about memory. We're going to think about the material reconstruction of putting life together. We're going to think about mourning. We're going to think about a bunch of different dimensions. But I realize that even now, much of what I'm going to be sharing with you has to do with how we use memories of past plagues, or rather how Jews of time past used memories of past plagues to cope with the ones that they were just facing. So in some ways, this is going to be a story of cycles. And I don't mean this to predict any future plagues or epidemics, but what we will be seeing in the course of our time here today is something of a cycle, is the way that the beginnings of coming epidemics are managed and made sense of with reference to the past, and how the past then sends different futures in different directions. Our look today is going to be mostly at Jewish life in the 17th and 18th centuries. Is the sound okay on the screen? Yeah? Okay, great. Just interrupt at any time and let me know if something needs a change. Our time today is going to be mostly about the 16th through 18th centuries, with a particular focus on the 17th and 18th in Europe, and particularly in Central Europe, in a period that historians call the early modern period. That's what historians of more general history call this, but historians of epidemics refer to this entire period as the second pandemic period. In the subset of epidemic history, historians who work on the period roughly from the year 1347 to the middle of the 18th century, to about 1750, like to refer to this, well, we don't like to. We tend to refer to this period as the second pandemic period. For us, and for many of the people that we study, this is an age that is marked by so many recurrences of epidemic, and of one epidemic in particular, of the bubonic plague, that we label the entire period as being marked by the recurrence of epidemic over and over and over again. The first major outbreak of the epidemic of the bubonic plague is in the year 1347, with the so-called Black Death that sweeps Eurasia and parts of North Africa, and lasts for a duration of about 5 years, although not everywhere all at once, but is largely something of a 5-year or 5 to 6 year period that at the time claimed anywhere between a third to a half of most human life in different parts of the continent or subcontinent, to varying degrees, but was really a disastrous and devastating plague. And although many of us, I think, know or we learn in different kinds of histories about the Black Death, what often escapes our attention is that for the next nearly 400 years or so, bubonic plague would recur in one or another parts of Europe or the Mediterranean basin or parts of Asia at least once a generation. It meant that this was almost a kind of commonplace cataclysm. for lack of a better word, or I like alliterative words, so I'm going to call it a commonplace cataclysm. It means that this was something that was at once catastrophic and disastrous, but also not something that was ever fully shocking or surprising. And so Europeans, Christians and Jews alike, Muslims as well, had to navigate the meaning of these epidemics with reference to the past and thinking about how to make sense of the present in terms of what had come before. It also, on the other hand, meant that they had a reservoir of tradition, of experience, the wisdom of experience to work with that turned their eyes to see things in particular ways. And it also meant that plague left its physical impact on the topography of cities. And that's why I've got this slide up for us here. In many cities of Central Europe, to some even to this day, a stone column rises above the central squares of old town districts. And these pillars pay homage to moments of plague. They are there to thank the divine for deliverance from plague. They feature more often in Catholic Central European cities than they do in Protestant ones. So that will... lovely. Yes, it's that thing in the center of the screen here, or I can just walk up to it. So here is a plague pillar. This is from one in Prague that was demolished at the end of the First World War. So if you visited Prague, you're not likely to see that one. I should have an image though for you. Good. These are some more contemporary ones that were you to visit. For example, Vienna, or other cities in the Czech Republic, for example. You could even see these plague columns standing to this very day. And this is not a bad moment for a shout out to one of the items that is in the exhibit outside. One of the texts that are just outside of this room recounts the plague epidemic in the city of Vienna in the year 1680. And so we can draw some connections between future travel destinations and the material that you see out there. These plague columns usually had two functions. They thanked God for deliverance from plague, but they also had a second function. They usually also thanked or prayed for deliverance or protection from a different kind of contagion, the contagion of heresy, and particularly of Protestant heresy. And so ideas of contagion or infection shared features across biological and physical threat, and also religious, intellectual, and ideational threats as well. They usually offered devotion to the Virgin Mary, and many psalms and prayers that were written in this time did that as well, linking issues of theological belief, but also physical health, healing, and escape from ailment. Well, okay, so now that I've told you that these are not just columns that are deliverance from plague, but rather have a particular Catholic hue and have a particular hue or attention to saints, Jews, on the other hand, are not devotees of the Virgin Mary. They're not members of the Catholic Church. And so these pillars that I show in front of you, in some ways, already attune us to the fact that they speak to collective experiences that some people are a part of, and another significant part of the population is not. Jews did not possess the same kinds of monuments. They weren't really included in these sorts of early modern monuments, and they didn't have the sovereignty over parts of a city to erect monuments of this stature and nature on their own. But like their Catholic and Protestant neighbors, Jews had various devices for memory of plague. And for Jews as a minority, and this is where we're going to go for most of our time here together, my contention is for Jews as a minority, thinking about, remembering, and mobilizing the memory of plague was bound up with two intertwined issues. On the one hand, deliverance from, or worry about, how's the sound going, Magda? Test, test. Are we okay? Okay, great. So two intertwined issues will accompany Jewish memory of plague. And that we'll see that both in the material aftermaths of plague and also in the longer kinds of memory and commemoration and ritualization of memory. And that is, on the one hand, the worry about the genuine health, bodily disease element of it. And the second is the pressures, the much intensified pressures that Jews as a minority faced from the wider social scape, and from political leadership. In any moment of epidemic crisis, it was possible, though not always necessary, and it was not always the case, but there was a distinct possibility that Jews would face a qualitatively different experience than their non-Jewish neighbors because there were additional pressures that would be placed upon them as a minority that could range from blame, for example, conspiracy theories, although we can talk more about that. I contend that those are not as prevalent. Theories that blame Jews for being conspiratorial, I contend that those were not as prevalent as popular memory in our own time believes, but Jews also received resources and care in differential ways. When resources were allocated by city governments across the city, they were allocated far more for the dominant majority society than they were for the Jewish society or sub-society living within it. In cities where there were ghettos with gates and walls around them, sometimes the ghetto itself could be turned into a quarantine zone with its gates locked, its windows and doors shut up, meaning that the people within then would have lesser opportunity to flee from the city, lesser opportunity for medicines, victuals, foodstuffs to be carried in, and even more tragically, for the bodies of the deceased to be carried out and to receive proper honoring burials at that. So a very complicated portrait when we think about any city, and the cases could be multiplied, but we think about cities like this, up and down the Italian peninsula, for example, a kind of differential experience that makes its way into the cultures of memory that follow. And so my goal here for us today is, once again, so I'm going to keep repeating what my goal is over and over again, and I will confess my goals in writing this talk changed over the course of writing it, which I think is what research is all about. As we let our fingers do the thinking with our research, the ideas that we have change over time, and even as we express them in the moment of putting things together, ideas crystallize and some ideas fade out of view, including sometimes that optimism that I naively once had, which is not to say that this will be a story that is devoid of hope entirely, but it is one that I'm trying to actually find my way. I'm trying to think about how much optimism to put into a story and how much sadness. And this is a project that Magda and I have been thinking about for quite some time together as well, but that's another story to be told another time. Maybe to get into a bit more, I'll skip that for now, maybe to get into a bit more of the human element, I'll show you this primary source that I've been working with for some time. And tell a little story. On the 25th of April, 1714, a woman by the name of Sarah Pearlhefter, that's a diminutive of Sarah, so we'll call her Sarah Pearlhefter, who was the wife of a deceased man named Moses Doctor. That is to say, a medic, somebody who performed medical services, opened her home to two officials of the Prague Jewish community. So we're in April of 1714. We're on the 25th of April. So that's like 2 weeks from what now would be the anniversary of the day that this woman opened her home to two members of Prague's Jewish community, the leaders of Prague's Jewish community, who strolled through her home. The officials were named Laser Bunzel and Zelig Zeigner. And what they did is they walked through and inventoried the materials and the contents in a home that had been thrown into disarray by the recent outbreak of the plague. Bubonic plague had ravaged the city of Prague since late July of 1713 and had subsided in December of 1713. So it was about a 5-some-odd month epidemic, but the after effects of the plague were felt for some time. And not just in the loss of life, but also the ways that family life and even the contents of homes were thrown into a kind of chaos. This Sarah's home was not the only one that was visited by delegates of the community. Over the following 12 months, Prague's Jewish leadership carefully inventoried the domestic possessions of at least 58 other women's homes and 4 men whose lives and households had been totally upended. Their job was to go through and to itemize all of the possessions that were there, because each of these women had become widows over the course of the epidemic that had just ravaged their neighborhood, home, community, and city. And as a result, questions about how to go forward, who could lay claim to these possessions, which could they keep as they built new homes, what did they owe to creditors, what did other debtors owe to them, were thrown suddenly into sharp relief. The normal routines of what is mine and what do I owe other people and what do my children get was thrown into particular sharp relief. That's because virtually all of the women in this record book that to this day is held in the city of Jerusalem in the Central Archives for the History of Jewish People, but it was composed in the city of Prague in the winter and spring of 1714 and well into 1715. All of these women were people who dealt in making small loans, or we might call them pawnbrokers. They were people who would hold onto objects from others in exchange for cash, or receive cash from others in exchange for these objects, which meant that their things were in each other's homes. Unlike, or maybe actually in some ways like our story of COVID, things play a really important role in pandemics and epidemics as well, though they're very, very easy to miss if we're only looking at paper trails. Do people remember those early days of the COVID pandemic when we were scrubbing our cans before we opened them? Or does that memory work with people? I remember very, very desperately scrubbing every can that would come into my home or leaving it outside of my front door. So there's a thingness to how plague works. And in the case of the bubonic plague, of this period that lasted for some 400 years, it wasn't things like cans that concerned people, but rather linens and materials. Whenever plague would rear its ugly head, one of the first orders that would come out from the leaders of a city or even an empire would be the destruction of contagious objects. Clothing would be actively burned. Beds would be actively burned, which also meant that in the aftermath of an epidemic, to survive was not to have overcome. In fact, one had to reconstruct a whole household out of what had been a denuded property. The very place to lay one's head was suddenly no longer available in many homes in which people had lived for years, meaning that the aftermath was not just one of moments of crisis, but of a continued crisis that required all kinds of rebuilding. A memoir from the Jewish female memoirist Glickl of Hameln from the mid-17th century in northern Germany helps us to really get at this story. She tells us that she lived through a pandemic, but so did her grandmother generations prior, who had fled their local city with her two children when the plague was most threatening, and they were forced to move from house to house, sleeping, she tells us, not in beds, but on floors of wood or stone. Amazing even just to think about not having a material place to rest your head. When the plague finally abated, though, she aspired to return home to air out her things. But she discovered when she got there that all of her prized possessions were gone. Tenants who had been living in her house had pried up the very floorboards, broken everything, taken most of her possessions. Nonetheless, the narrative continues. My grandmother, may she rest in peace, had several pledges, that means loans, or rather items that are placed in pawn brokerage that provided a living for her and her daughters. And it was through this kind of microcredit that she was able to arrange for life to go on. So just a short story like this shows us something of the tensions of homes that are stripped of their materials, either because they're dangerous, or in the case of floorboards, sometimes to build coffins, or to build boards that could carry the deceased out of homes themselves. Plague makes its impression felt, or epidemic can make its impression felt on the very materials of the way that we live. We're going to have the opportunity to come back and think about some of those immediate aftermaths, but now I'd like to bring that circle back to the start of plague, and we'll work through them carefully, or you can decide maybe not so carefully together. Two cases from Italy, I think, will allow us to think not just about the material dimensions of plague, but also about how the last past plague, the memory of the previous plague, often inspired or shaped the thinking about the present. I'm going to take us to two cases from Italy. So we were in Prague for a little bit, then we moved to northern Germany for a bit. And in the spirit of trying to give you something of a panoramic view of different cases of epidemic in different parts of early modern Europe, I thought we could turn our attention south of the Alps to Italy for a bit. There's a danger methodologically in what I'm doing as well, because every epidemic operates differently. And the way that an epidemic is received depends on the decisions that are made by people in the local place in which that epidemic takes place. So I'm taking a dangerous methodological step by looking at different places. And yet, nonetheless, I thought for the purpose of our conversation here, it would be useful to look at different cases and different instances and different sources that emerge from different places. This is perhaps a useful aside to say, I'm working on a book right now where I'm trying to reconstruct a plague epidemic, as Magda said, in just one place, in a very short amount of time, to try to understand how something works in a very local context. But since I'm not sure if you came here to hear just about one place, I thought I would offer us different examples, and you can take me to task for it later if we think that it's too far out of the bounds of method. But I think we can look to two Italian cases to tell us just a little bit about memory. The first case that we'll look at comes from one of the very few texts of its kind, a plague account written in Hebrew from Padua, from the Italian city of Padua. The plague epidemic was in 1630, 1631, and its author was a man named Abraham Catalano, who was a communal leader among Jews, a physician, and a member of Padua's plague response team. When the plague hit Padua in 1630, 4 men were appointed to be plague czars. They were the ones who were going to run the response team, and Catalano was one of those men. He survived the plague. That's why he was able to write about it and reflect on it afterwards, but not without experiencing considerable loss. Even as he oversaw the plague response of the Jewish community in the city, he was also under immense pressure. He watched people around him die at the hands of plague and even lost close family members, including his spouse, his wife. Catalano penned a chronicle of the event. And I want to note that he wrote it in manuscript. That's what a manuscript is, but it has only survived to this day in manuscript. It has never been printed, which also means it didn't receive a wide readership. And we can raise different questions about what his intentions were for it, but we don't have to look too far because he tells us a little bit about why he wrote this very text down. He tells us that there are 3 purposes to why he did this. The first is to enlighten and teach that it is our Lord whose anger burns and that none can be saved from his hand. The living should take heart to root out transgression and terminate sin, lest the evil infect them and in their sin they die. So the first reason that he's writing this is to let people understand that plague epidemic is a divine punishment, and the first line of action is for us to check our own sins, the balance sheet of our own behavior, in order to avert disaster. Note that he uses a word to describe sin, or maybe he uses a single word ambiguously to talk on the one hand about evil and on the other hand to talk about the evil of epidemic itself. He uses the Hebrew word for infection. And in my reading, it's not clear to me which evil he means. Does it mean ill-doing, or a very common word that was used at the time in multiple languages to describe plague was to simply call it the evil? In German, it's called Übel, for example. It's referred to euphemistically as this evil, but the word infection works for him in multiple valences at once. Here's, I think, where it gets even more interesting. The second purpose is so that the coming generations should know, so it's clear that he does intend this for a readership. This is not just a private diary that he's going to tuck away. He's anticipating readers. How many readers is difficult to say, but he is clearly intending this for posterity. When times of danger come to the world, the practices and preparations that are appropriate in such days as we did in our own time. He's keeping a record, a kind of guide of this is what we did, and hopefully this will guide you in the future. But then he continues, for in this story, I shall suggest not only everything that we did, but also that which we ought to have done to be spared from this misfortune at all. And others should grow wiser from the folly of others. Learn not only from what we did right, but learn also from our mistakes. I think this part is this I really loved. I almost didn't notice it the first and second and third time I read it. Magda, you probably noticed it the very first time that you read it, but it took me some time to notice the amazing intellectual, almost humility to acknowledge on the one hand that there were some successes in combating plague, but also from the very moment of writing about it to wrestle with all of the failings and to hope that others do better than us, even as there's an implicit recognition here that we didn't do as good as we could have. The third purpose is that children will be fortified in the ways of nature rather than to walk in darkness. So if the first point was about respecting God's will, the third has a bit of a scientific thread to it. It says individual households should know. After I reveal the story to them, they will know how householders should act in order to save their souls. You should also know a little bit about epidemiology or what kind of cures work better. Catalano was trying to put all of these out for people to understand. So there's lessons to be learned from catastrophe, or at least Catalano and other recorders of memory believe that there are lessons to be learned. Some of them on the spiritual plane, some of them on a policy plane, and some of them on a very practical or pragmatic plane about remedies. But I thought I would take us into also a second Italian case from this century of epidemics, although actually this one is from a century prior, from the year 1556, from the 16th century city of Udine. Their memory of epidemic retained a long afterlife in a different kind of urban monument. Not a plague pillar, and unfortunately I don't have an image for you of this, but I'll put a word on the screen in just a moment. In a single house in this city, from a plague epidemic in the year 1556, a word stands on a wall of the home, and the word is remember. In 1556, all of the Jews of the city were expelled whole scale. And a memoir that survives from the time, a diarist from the year 1556, recounted that this word was placed on the house a full half century prior. It's probably not true, but the memoirist says this word was placed on the house a full half century prior, from the year 1511, from a previous outbreak of plague, when this had been a Jewish home there as well, and when, according to the memoirist, writing 50 years on. So this person was likely not of the clearest of memory if they had even lived in this place to begin with. This person, the memoirist, wrote, this was the selfsame house 50 years ago that had been ground zero for plague, and it is ground zero now in 1556, and inscribed on the building itself is now the word remember, to know that there was good reason to expel the Jews from the city in 1556, for it is the Jewish home that repeatedly was the place from which this grave misfortune befell our city. And actually this home no longer stands, but scholars were researching this site right up until the early 20th century, where this building with this word on it remained. So although there's actually little evidence that the earlier outbreak can be attributed to this point of origin, this quite literal writing on the wall, for that is what this is, this writing on the wall was set to establish the terms for centuries to follow. A justification of the expulsion of the Jews and a continued mistrust of them for the good of the city for centuries to come. And I think that these two different examples from Italy, one written by a Jew about Jews, for it's written in a Hebrew, which means that it is likely for the consumption of other Jews. And on the other hand, one written about and on a Jewish space and place in the absence of Jews, I think helps us to see some of those dual tensions that I was trying to point us towards at the beginning of this discussion here. On the one hand, there is the grappling with what do we do to assert and establish health and remedy, and on the other hand, the additional pressures that come from being a minority upon whom suspicion and suspect can so easily fall. How are we doing for time? We started a little late, but I also want to make sure that we have time to look at other things. Can do. Very, very good. Okay, so what I think that I'll do also is then take us into thinking about different ways in which that last past plague could serve people as they girded their loins for it. And we're going to still use this dual paradigm. On the one hand, thinking about avoiding the plague itself, and on the other hand, grappling with the kind of things that people do to each other. So fighting microbes on the one hand, and combating and responding to human decision on the other, to make it somewhat more abstract. What you see on the screen in front of you is a prayer from the city of Prague. I'm going to zoom in back on the city of Prague where those plague columns were for the next 3 or 4 minutes or so. What you see on the screen in front of you is a prayer that was printed for Prague plague. I challenge any of you to say that 5 times fast, but it's difficult to even write this book. I keep doing typos between plague and Prague and prayer. This is a prayer that was printed 6 full months or 5 full months before the arrival of plague in the city. For memories of plague past also provided people with the materials that they could recycle or repurpose or use even before a new epidemic arrived. The printing of plagues was something that was commonly done. So here is back to our Padua Chronicle that tells us printing prayer before arrival of plague was a very, very common mode of being ready in advance, that remembering traditions, remembering liturgy, and using those traditions and liturgy could be the first line of defense against. And you're welcome to take photos of this, and we can look back at slides afterwards if people want to talk about them. Here's a prayer that was printed in Venice in 1630, a prayer so that plague may not come. It's prophylactic, it's preventative. It's not waiting until plague hits, but instead drawing on memories and experience past, maybe even to avert plague before it arrives. Here's a prayer book that was printed in 1717 that has written in the prayer book itself. So in the normal flow of prayers has a subsection of, here are prayers to avert or mitigate the impact of plague when it comes. The fact that these are printed into books that will sit on people's shelves as part of their everyday use, I think tells us, it shows us the way plague and epidemic are not totally unexpected surprises. They're part of the rhythm of life, and also that people were equipped with them in between. In fact, we might even, as I was writing this, I started to think about maybe we shouldn't even think about afters of epidemics, or at least for early moderns, there wasn't quite an after to think of. We might better categorize it as in-betweens. And so that's when I circle back to the worry over the "this too shall pass." For Jews and Catholics and Protestants and more, one existed between epidemics more than one did afterwards. Now, of course, there were different degrees of intensity. The during was most intense, the aftermath, a different kind of intensity, but it was hard to think of, or at least I think it was hard to think of, disease as ever being completely outside of the realm of experience. And I think looking at items like this, printed prayer books, tells us that there was a market. There was an expectation, there were horizons of expectation and perspective that plague was a recurring feature of life that one needed in a recurring fashion to draw upon. These are somewhat official prayer books that are written usually for recitation by quora of men in male spaces, but these permeated other kinds of writings as well. This is a Yiddish language book that was written for women. It's in Yiddish, which is more of a women's vernacular amongst Central European and Eastern European Jewish communities. And in fact, the title itself calls it a book of skills and women's aid. These were a very popular kind of publication of the 17th and 18th centuries. They're books of remedies or healing. Some people call them books of charms, but I prefer to stay away from that title because I think it makes them sound not serious. And for them, these were quite serious ways of dealing with life. These books are not solely dedicated to dealing with plague. Rather, they deal with a whole gamut of health and remedy and healing experiences that usually fell upon the shoulders of women. They're amazing books. They have usually short snippets of advice that sometimes come with recipes for building certain kinds of medicines, but they also take into account behavioral health. So they talk about how to alleviate menstrual cramps, on the other hand, or how to how to energize fertility. Or they talk about how to ingest certain things so that when you're drinking with friends, you don't get too drunk. Or how to ingest certain things so that when you're drinking with friends, you get drunk more easily. Or how to stop children from having nightmares or from wetting the bed. Or how to write in invisible ink so that when you're sending letters to relatives in prison, that not everybody else will be able to read them. And the list goes on. But it is almost impossible to find something like this that talks about everything that I've said just now is very daily, is very ordinary. Well, except perhaps for the imprisonment, but that's a longer story as well. But the other things about the norms of menstrual cramps or fertility or drunkenness or crying children or are all part of the norms of life, and they all inevitably also contain sections about how to cope with plague, as if this is part of the gamut of experiences that one can expect in one's ordinary life. If these are all elements on the one hand for dealing with the norms of microbes, on the other hand, thinking about past plagues also furnished both city administrators and Jews themselves with questions about how to combat policies or how to implement policies. The document that you see in front of you is from the year 1713, and it's by the Habsburg emperors in the city of Vienna, sending instructions to the Prague city leaders about what to do. And in recurring places in this document and in others like it, it makes reference to the last past plague and what we did with Jews then. It says things like, whereas last time Jews were allowed to enter and exit the city and move into the countryside, this time around we must do something different. So somewhat in the Catalano style of learning from past mistakes, the 1713 documents, the 1713 policies say, we used to let Jews move about. We now plan to enclose them within the ghetto walls to make sure that disease does not spread. Now, it's hard for us as moderns to be critical of this as well, or rather, it requires a balancing act. On the one hand, there is a discrimination against the minorities. On the other hand, there is a public health that is being looked out for, and I'll leave it up to you to make decisions about what should be and how to evaluate that past. But what I think is just as remarkable about this is that it was not only the government that was making reference to past plagues. At the exact same time, we have Jews in the city. This is an old friend of mine named David Oppenheim, who was a collector of books, but he was also a collector of documents. And this man, at the same time, had letters that had been written by the imperial offices from the previous plague and the plague before that and the plague before that, from 1625, from 1649, from 1680, and keeping copies of a 1713 plague, also that I believe, I contend, he and other Jewish elders and leaders of the city could push back against government discrimination, could use past precedent not only to conduct policy on their own, but also to dispute, to say, this is not how it was done before, and we call back on those previous policies and privileges to argue that things should be as they were, rather than in the imposition of new draconian measures. I'll close in just a moment, and we can come back and look at other things along the way by thinking also about the way that stories that are told long afterwards seek to make sense, seek to build memory anew. One of the best examples of this is not a Jewish text at all, but rather is the marvelous fictional, but not necessarily ahistorical, Journal of the Plague Year that was written by the London writer Daniel Defoe, who was working to make sense of an epidemic from the year 1665. He was doing this when plague was rearing its head for the last time in Western Europe, although I don't know how he could have known that it was the last time. But during the Great Plague of Marseille, in 1720, Defoe wrote a fictionalized journal of the plague year from the year 1665 to try to evoke and invoke memories of quite some time prior. And Jews did something much the same in their own time. In the years after the 1713 plague in Prague, Jews wrote multiple poems or songs recounting what had happened. I can go into more detail about what happens in all of them, but for the purposes of our limited last 2 minutes here today, what I'll also point out is one of the things these songs do is they also iron out, they smooth over tensions or crises. They provide a blueprint not only for remembering the past, but also for moving forward. For when we look at the other sources that I've shown you on the screen, it's possible to uncover all kinds of tensions and clashes within the community, between rich and poor, between haves and have-nots, people who flee the city and leave others behind to fend for themselves, doctors who negotiate over their salaries and refuse to go and see people until the community is willing to write them better contracts, which I can also understand. They're putting their lives at risk. They should maybe get a good ROI, a good return on those investments. But all of those kinds of tensions and clashes and conflicts don't find much of a way into memorial texts like this at all, which tells us that there's also a work of forgetting that needs to take place also in the path to move forward. That memory is sometimes not always the best guide for a community or a collective to heal together. And I think the authors of texts like this knew exactly that. There's so much more that I want to show you, and I'm happy to talk about more. But I think that perhaps this is a useful place for us to draw this part of the conversation or the lecture to a close, to think about not just how memory works, but also forgetting. And so to recap, we have looked at a number of different cases here. We've looked at the immediate aftermath of an epidemic that wreaks havoc not only in loss of life, but shapes the way people live their domestic habitus afterwards and embroils them in legal struggles and all kinds of conflicts and negotiations. We've looked at the way that memory informs how the next plague relies on the last past plague. And we've also thought about the different ways in which Jews share features with their surroundings, combating illness, but on the other hand are faced with distinctive kinds of pressures. And finally, we've looked at how an overcoming can also bring a kind of forgetfulness to it. And just to tease with others, if we have more time, we can talk about rituals of memory and some gendered elements there. But I think this is probably a good place for us to stop so we can get to look at some of the goods out there. So thank you.